What's up, Grummies? Welcome to Aurora Office Hours, your source for free cannabis cultivation education. I am your moderator, Kaisha. This is episode 127. Shout out to our live viewers on YouTube and Instagram, and to everyone tapping in on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, or wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you so much for your support. And if you like the pod, drop us a review. We absolutely appreciate your feedback. Jason and Cian are in the house. Guys, how you doing?
Doing great, Kaisha.
Fantastic.
We're doing good.
Wonderful. You ready for our first question?
Sure. Let's hit it.
All right, let's get into it. All right, so Billy dropped this one. It's lengthy. I'm going to read through it and we'll talk about it. So, you're right. How's it going, dudes? Hope you're having a wonderful Thursday. We have an issue we've been struggling with for a bit and have a few paths we're thinking about taking. Would love some insight. Around week 3 to 5, we see our runoff pH fall to the low 5s or into the 4s after the plants have been otherwise raging for multiple weeks. We run 1 gallon cocoa, 3.7 EC, 6.0 pH, front row ag, pretty even canopy, par around 1100 ppfd, 1300 ppm CO2, and minimal swings outside of our 1.1 VPD target at 81 degrees leaf temp. We run a pretty tight irrigation window with 0.5 gallons per hour whips and 2-minute shots spaced 10 minutes apart until we hit field capacity plus 200 to 300 milliliters runoff, then begin drybacks for 22 plus hours. We are debating between running a lower EC and pushing more runoff, running a higher feed and pushing more runoff, keeping the feed strength the same but adding more shots to increase runoff, or hand feed reset of our blocks once a week. The big volume all at once from a hand feed has been effective at resetting pH, but it comes with extra labor that we would love our irrigation to handle instead. We don't want the blocks to channel when sending a lot of volume through the lines too quickly, so we were wanting to know if you have any pointers on steps we might take to achieve better runoff pH going into our bulking. You guys are the best and we appreciate everything you do. All right.
Awesome question. I mean, I love how he's given us so much information to get a great answer to them in this question. So, I'm gonna just nail it. Channeling. Usually, we only see it if we get things too low, and that's especially in rock wool. With cocoa, I can push down to typically 15 to 20% and not necessarily see too much channeling, especially with like a 0.5. If I'm at a 1 or 2 gallon dripper, sometimes I'll see that a little higher water contents, but yeah, you don't get too worried about that. I do think that we hopefully can provide some information that you won't have to hand water there. So at 3.70 C, 6 pH, front row ag, everything is looking pretty good in there. And if we're looking at weeks 3 to 5, I guess my question would be is where are we ending those generative strategies? All right. So if we're adding P2s at week, say 4, and that's what's ending up correcting the pH that you're seeing, then I would probably just feed a little bit heavier earlier on. And you could go up to 4 and see if that fixes it. Obviously, when we talk about pH runoff, we're always looking at what is our nutrient composition balance. And I pull up that PowerPoint all the time that has, hey, here's our cations, here's our anions, right? So if we're feeding it at 6, that means that, okay, this is where we're at with that balance and some pH correctors in that fertigation system. When those plants are uptaking some of those nutrients, it's not always exactly as it's supplied. So sometimes they'll be pulling, let's see, in this case, they're probably pulling a little bit more anions. I'd have to look it up. I always get the pH just a little bit goofed up with it's negative log, right? So basically, it's running out of negatively charged ions in there. That's why it's dropping. And so when we up that feed a little bit, sometimes we can just balance out that nutrition that's being supplied to the plants, and you won't necessarily have to push a higher amount of runoff. Basically, what you said is both of those are good options. So, what I wouldn't do is lower my feed as far as the options that you've provided here. So, I guess there's 2 parts to my answers here. One would be if when you're switching to vegetative, it corrects that pH, then I may not get too concerned, but you could just up your EC during, say, weeks 2, 3. If you've got really good EC levels, say in the plant at like 4 to 7 coming out of edge, then you could actually do up that EC first week even. But if not, then yeah, weeks 2 and 3, you got to up that EC, see if that corrects things. The problem with adding P2s for runoff is now we are actually kind of starting a slightly vegetative type of irrigation. And some plants don't mind that. When we talk about vegetative versus generative, it's always that one or the other. And this is where the spectrum comes in, where, all right, for some plant types, we can actually run a little bit more balanced, and we're seeing a really good result. Obviously, typically when we're pushing for a generative, it's to one, establish the correct plant physiology as early as possible in the plant life cycle. And a lot of times for things like LCGs, we actually go a little bit more generative pretty much the whole life cycle. So for these plant types, the first steps I would take, yeah, you just up the ECs in weeks 2 and 3. If that's not an option, then okay, let's just push a little bit more runoff. So it comes down to logistics as well. Like, all right, ideally, sure, let's see if a little bit higher EC fixes the runoff pH during those weeks. If it sounds like it's correcting itself by the time that you're back in vegetative, may not be a huge concern anyways. But you're kind of on that, like, all right, we're an A grower, so let's get to an A plus grower kind of range, and that would be an option. If that's not super easy to do, you've got shared batch tanks, your direct inject for multiple rooms, that type of thing, then yeah, just push a little bit more runoff, see if it keeps it above, above like 5.3, 5.4, 5.5. If you can keep that pH runoff at 5.5, then we know, all right, our imbalance is probably not affecting plant growth at all. If we're lower than 5, yeah, it might be substantially affecting plant growth. So those would be the first 2 steps that I would take in this situation. But yeah, if it's correcting itself by the time you're back in vegetative, you might even just you might even just ramp into vegetative. A lot of times when we talk about it, it's like I said, one or the other. If you have good ability to manipulate irrigations based on the day, or you want to put a little extra effort in there into week 3, week 4, then all right, let's just start adding P2s in there, and that might correct your pH a little bit sooner. And it comes down to how your plant's responding. Are you seeing negative effects, deficiencies in our elemental composition in the nutrients on the plants? If not, then maybe it's correcting itself quickly enough with your vegetative irrigations that you don't have to make huge changes. Super fun question, because it's like you're doing everything right.
The one thing I was kind of thinking of is, if you're not trying to potentially push too much more runoff, maybe just looking at increasing the time you're allowing in between your P1 shots to be able to decrease your total dryback window just a little bit. Sometimes that can help kind of reduce the intensity of salt buildup in such a way that you're not fighting yourself when you are trying to raise that input EC a little bit. But like Jason said, sounds like you're doing the majority of the equation just the way you should be. And pushing too much more runoff may well, not be an option that is A, cost effective in labor, like you were talking about, and B, may not result really in pushing your plants to do the best they possibly could. Because like Jason said, some strains out there really do better when driven harder generatively earlier on, and ramping that, as Jason said, right up into your vegetative stage.
You guys have given Billy a lot to think about. Thank you so much for that. Jason, something you want to add?
No, I was just adjusting.
No? Okay. But then also just want to mention, we dropped one of our education guides in the chat, some 5 facts everybody should know about pH. So, putting it all together, Billy, keep us posted on how it's going. And thank you so much for submitting your awesome question. All right, I'm going to keep it moving here. We got this write-in from North Fork Farms, who wrote, so I'm having an interesting problem with saturation. We are in 1.5 gallon cocoa pots and are hitting a VWC of 77 to 80%. However, we ran this same brand of cocoa in 1 gallon pots before, and our max VWC was only 65 to 70%. I'm thinking the sensor could be too low since there is no slot for 1.5 gallon pots on the sensor placement tool. Another strange thing is that the VWC increased throughout flower, not decreased like they typically do. What do you guys think? Thank you and have a great day.
Yeah, you could be absolutely right. And it's one of those things when I recommend to people anytime that they're using a new media or they have any concerns about those exact numbers with VWC being read from the sensor, that is do some tests. Get yourself a kitchen scale and saturate the media. And anytime I'm doing any changes, especially in cocoa, I like to. So I will saturate my substrate, whether it's 1 gallon, gallon and a half, 2 gallon, 3 gallon. I'll, completely compressed block. I'll saturate it typically with something like, 6 pH, 0 EC. And then I want to see what happens just in the runoff of that. This is going to do us a couple things, right? Having that runoff is just validating that our cocoa is well buffered. It kind of gives us an idea of what the native EC in that cocoa batch is. But in your case, after it's been saturated, let's get that one of those sensors in there. If you have a Solus, you can check it with your Solus. If you have an Arroyo sensor, stick it in there for 10, 30 minutes and you'll get a few readings from it. And that'll give you the reading water content, and you can compare that with what your actual water weight is in there. So that kitchen scale I was talking about, weigh the compressed block before you saturate it. That'll give you your dry weight, and then we will saturate it, make sure that we've got a good saturation. We did get a little bit of runoff, but it's no longer running off. Then weigh it again at that. I like to call it field capacity because it's a little different than saturation, but weigh it at that field capacity point, and that'll be your dry matter plus water weight, right? So let's subtract the dry weight from that, and we'll know, hey, that's the water that we added to this. If you do a little division, that'll give you your percent water content by volume, right? So we know, all right, let's say we got 1,200 grams of water in there. So that's 1,200 milliliters also. Nice. The metric system does that with water. If we divide our volume by that, volume of the substrate by that, then that gives us our volumetric water content. And that there's really no calibration or adjustment. As long as our kitchen scale is correct, that's an absolute value. And what we can do is we can adjust our sensor height just slightly to completely match that substrate. Obviously, with the template tool, we did our best. We ran multiple sizes of substrates that were available at the time and said, okay, this is a pretty good approximation of those water contents for that substrate size, and then broke it down so it's mostly as easy as possible for users. If you have a substrate that's not necessarily standard, obviously there's more and more sizes and types of cocos coming out now than when we built those templates, then you can just build a template for yourself, right? So I think we're at what, like 1.25 for 1 to 2 gallon, or maybe it's 1 gallon at 1.25, 2 to 3 gallons at like 2 inches. Yeah, just measure up from the bottom. You can use a piece of cardboard. If you want to get fancy, use a piece of wood, plastic, whatever. Mark your height. I used to just use a ruler for all my installations back in the day. And, we might be at 1.6 is giving us the most accurate reading for that substrate specifically.
I was going to say the same thing. My experience with mine, whenever I see numbers that are trending on that higher end of things, the first question I ask is, have I poked my sensor a little too low, or sometimes have I put my sensor in a position where its tines are poking a little bit too low? Every once in a while, not ideal, but I have found myself, with a careless installation of my own making, where I pointed the tines down a little ways, where I'm like, oh, well, that figures. I'm seeing a little bit higher numbers than I was expecting with this one. And just double checking yourself with those things. Like Jason mentioned, using a ruler is a great way to be able to find a custom placement. I've experimented with a bunch of different mediums over the years and had to find placements that were not necessarily on the template at the time. And experimenting with both, you doing the method Jason described, weighing things out to try and be able to ascertain pretty accurate VWC measurements and understand your substrate that way is a wonderful way to do it. I've also gone a little bit lower tech and just gone on the fly with a Solus and poked, a number of pots around the room at differing heights with that ruler and figured out what seemed to approximate the most usable water content over the time too. I would say Jason's method is by far more accurate. However, in a pinch, you can bring the sensors into a position that gives you a lot more clarity by making sure that you're getting a reading that's similar on each sensor each time that you're actually getting it, rather than maybe this guy put the template a little bit wonky when he placed it, or maybe wasn't paying attention like me and poked it down through the substrate. Little things like that, along with measuring a consistent height that works well for your substrate, can definitely do quite a bit with correcting high numbers like that.
And there's a second part to this question that I want to make sure we try to address at least. I don't know if that we're going to give you the right answer for it, but you saw your field capacity numbers were increasing over the cycle, right? So let's say, all right, at day 5, we saw field capacity at 72%. And day 30, we saw field capacity at 76%. Lots of kind of physics and stuff going on here. There are some cocoa manufacturers that actually will variate the different pith of the cocoa from the bottom to the top. Maybe we're actually washing some of the smaller pith cocoa down towards the bottom. It's going to have a little bit higher water holding capacity simply because they're smaller particles. There's more surface area to hang on to the water. And on the other side of that, obviously, when we're in smaller medias, sometimes we see those numbers go down. We've got roots that are building matter in the substrate. They're compacting some of that substrate. And then on the flip side, they're also building capillary space, which the sensor is reading the amount of water in your roots as well. So when we think about, all right, our cocoa to start with, it's mostly just airspace and cocoa and water, fertigation water, right? And then when our roots are growing in there, well, now we've got some amount of root mass, but we've also compacted that cocoa, and those capillaries are building and filling with water. The sensor doesn't know if that water is in the cocoa or if it's in those actual root capillaries themselves.
Fantastic, you guys. Thank you for that, North Fork Farms. Thank you so much for your question. Good luck. All right, well, we've mentioned the Solus a couple of times. We actually got a question about from a Solus user. F90 wrote in, "Hi guys, greetings from Germany. Just got my first Solus sensor and my poor water EC always goes down with my dry back. Shouldn't it be rising? I'm in a 5.4 liter pot using Canna Cocoa Professional plus substrate, day 13 of flower, running 1100 ppfd and 1.2 kPAs, feeding Canna Cocoa and AB steering gen, trying to stack some EC. Feeding pH at 5.8 EC, 2.2 dryback is 20% VWC. With my P1 irrigation, my poor water EC goes up to 2.3, and at the end of P3, my poor water EC is 1.7. Runoff 20% of irrigation volume, pH 5.9, EC 2.2. Plants look fine. What do you guys think about that?
I think you're underfeeding. Really, the only time that I see that EC goes down when our water content goes down is just that the plants are actually eating nutrients faster than they're eating the amount of water in the substrate. Super easy solution: just give your plants more food. And this is actually, I've been working with a number of European growers, and it's kind of like we were at stateside here maybe 5-10 years ago. Was people were really scared of burning their plants, feeding it nutrition levels that actually tomato growers pretty much typically grow at. As far as
Yeah, the
commercial,
conventional wisdom told us, no, don't do that.
yeah,
Don't jack up your feeds. It's going to burn all your root systems away.
yeah, yeah. The cool parts, we got enough science here to kind of explain that, cannabis doesn't necessarily burn nutrient burn until we're way up there in EC levels, 10 plus, like well over 10. Um, what those signs are typically nutrient imbalances or pH corrections that need to be made. So, if you're seeing 1.7 on an EC anywhere, feed EC, red zone EC, and you've got a Solus that's tracking that, that seems like a pretty easy answer to me. Is let's make sure that we're feeding it 3 to 4 EC at the minimum, as long as our environments are appropriate.
Couldn't agree more. Bump that feed up a little bit. A lot of times, if I see numbers like that, especially early on in my growth cycles, I'm like, oh, these ones are eating very, very quickly. Let's give you more food and make sure that you have everything you need to keep growing big and strong.
All right, you guys, thanks for your insights on that. I'm just going to share this comment from Anxiety. See, I don't know about that. My EC will drop overnight too, but I think that's the sensor not reading properly with low water in pot, because as soon as I water some, it goes back up to what I figured it was at.
It's not sure, maybe not enough info in there. Usually, specifically with the Teros 12s, when we're in low water contents, our ECs will actually be approximated too high. And that's why kind of this first answer was super easy, because of the tens of thousands of charts that I've looked at, and with the Teros 12, on those Soluses, for example, like that EC is going to go up even when we're aired because of low water contents. When we're looking at water contents less than, probably like 25%, that Teros 12 has a little bit harder time than the Teros 1 getting a really accurate EC level. That being said, it's kind of something that, we'd expect is it's going higher. If you're using Teros 12 and your EC is still going down when your water content's going down, yeah, you got to get more food.
All right, there it is. Thank you guys for that. Thank you for the question from Germany. Good luck. All right, we're going to keep going here. We've gotten a lot of live questions on YouTube. Thanks, Gromies, for dropping them. Dustin dropped this one. All right. For someone who is just learning, what is the order of importance? PPFD, slab EC, runoff EC, getting proper dryback, CO2, VPD. Does the importance change with yield versus quality? Good mid-ground. Side note, largest issue I have is getting temps in check when running 1050 ppfd, but can keep them in check at 900 ppfd. All right, so what do you guys think? How would we address this? Order of importance.
Yeah, so there's a pretty easy answer for me to start this with. Obviously, when we get down the chain of importance, it gets a little bit more tricky, right? But when we're looking at the photosynthetic equation, we have CO2 plus water, catalyzed by light, it's giving those sucrose molecules that the plant's growing from. So CO2 levels and light. If we don't have enough light, we cannot catalyze the appropriate chemical reactions in order for the plant to build up to its potential. Right. So, making sure that we have those, 8 to 1400 ppfd levels, depending on the strain. If you don't know anything about the strain, then go 9 to 1100 peak in flower. And then obviously CO2 levels. Yeah, for our mixed light growers, outdoor growers, you don't have the opportunity to increase that as easily. For indoor growers, my general rules, we always want PPFD plus 200 equals our ppm. All right, so in this case, let's say I'm 1,000 ppfd. I want to be probably at 1,200 ppm floating for my CO2 levels in there. So those are pretty much the most important first ones. The caveat there is always, well, everything kind of else has to be in check to make the best of those, right? If those are they're catalyzing and founding the best growth for the plant, We also want environmental levels to be correct. So anytime that I'm working with a client and I haven't looked at their graphs or they're a new client, I don't even look at root zone stuff until I look at their environmentals. One, for the most part, outside of facility constraints, environmentals are the easiest to fix. Making sure that, hey, I always look at temperature and VPD. So when I look at a graph, I typically have VPD and temperature on top, water content and EC on bottom. And I'll start with the top graph. All right, are our temperatures where we want our temperatures to be? Are the temperatures we want them to be appropriate for plant growth? Those are the kind of the two questions. And then we look at VPD. Is VPD helping this plant grow to the best of its potential at that phase in its life cycle? All right. So, early on, say late veg, we're looking at VPDs. We want them 0.6 to 0.9. Early flower, let's go 0.9 to 1.1. Mid flower, we're shooting for 1 to 1.2. Late flower, we may push up to 1.4 if we're trying to combat botrytis and molds and mildews. Typically, that 1.2 range is pretty good if we're not trying to combat that. So that's where I start with. If those are all in check, then we'll work through our EC levels, our water content levels. Right. EC levels, we're looking a lot of times at the trending of those charts. Kind of to roll back to that last question we had there is, all right, what is the EC doing? Is it showing that the plant has enough nutrition? Is it critically low? Not very often do I actually run into it being critically high. Typically, by the time that I'm out of veg, I want my root zone EC to be in that 4 to 7 range. And kind of answering some of more of those questions, like, all right, well, runoff EC or root zone EC. Once you've got a grasp on your root zone EC, I wouldn't even waste my time looking at runoff EC personally. Those sensors in that root zone are telling you what the plant's feeling, right? When we're doing things like our first question, pushing a little bit more runoff or upping ECs to fix runoff pH. Yes, runoff pH, very important because it's one of the only things other than leaf tissue analysis that can tell you about nutritional balance. That being said, our runoff EC used to be important until we had root zone sensors. Now that we have root zone sensors, we don't have to use runoff EC to infer what that level is in the plant's root zone.
That is a just really, really well stated answer, Jason. You went through all of the major points and like in the exact way that my mind came to him too is just being able to look at how much light, how much CO2, do you have water and nutrients that are appropriate? Those are your basics, right? Like, say you're doing all this in a tent in your basement and you only have limited resources. Focus there first, but also do you have appropriate heat and airflow? Can you get CO2 in there to be able to match your lighting? And all of these little questions that start kind of predicting whether or not you're going to be able to have the type of success that you want with it. As you scale, kind of like Jason said, all of those factors need to be working together in concert in order to be able to really achieve the success that you want. And that even I would say becomes more important when you start looking at the upper echelons of what you're trying to get with yield and quality. All of those factors have to be working together in the right ways to be able to maximize the success you can get out of individual cultivars.
Yeah, I know I'm doing a good job over here. If I give you nothing to work off of, an expert like you should have, like, I'd be like, oh, Jason missed this and he missed that. So thanks, man.
I was like sitting here thinking about like what should I mention, and then you just kind of kept ticking them right off the list. I was impressed, man. That's great.
Jason Van Leuven, blinding the Grummies with science since 2021. We appreciate it. So good. Amazing. Thank you both so much for your insights into that. And Dustin, keep us posted. Good luck. All right, we're going to keep it moving. Oh, let me reveal the poll. That's right. We have a poll going on YouTube right now. So we asked folks to shout out their location. We got 10% representing central US, 10% representing the West Coast. We got 40% representing the East Coast and 40% are overseas. So amazing. Welcome to the pod, y'all. We're so happy you're here. Thank you for dropping your questions. Just glad you're listening too. All right, we got this question from Indie Buds. They wrote, when a strain is not performing in our setup and you know it can deliver, how do you know where to start changes? Is it VPD changes, nutrient mix, lights? How to know what to adjust and what plants want? This felt like a good connection to the last question.
Oh, fun question. Yeah. So where do we start? Well, I always start with the records that I have. So do I have any growing information about how this plant behaves? Is that maybe previous growth cycles that I've taken written documentation on, maybe digital, hopefully data logged documentation on growth? Do I have any connections with someone else that has grown it, or possibly the breeder that grew it? Those are the places that I like to start, because they at least give me some direction on being, all right, well, do I run a longer specific type of crop steering strategy? Do I just want to, marginalize how hard I'm pushing these crop steering strategies? And then if you don't have any of that, I like to look at plant height and just morphological behaviors. If we have a plant that is growing more stubby, more stocky, lots of whiter lower leaves, then typically I'll push it slightly more vegetative, or I'll just cut my generative type of crop steering phase off pretty early. So I think like Mac 1 and Blue Dream, I have been talking about these two for probably 3 or 4 years as my examples, simply because they're about as far on the spectrum as any of the strains that I'm familiar with. And so I was talking about maybe it's a shorter, stockier, stubbier plant, fatter leaves, a little bit lower under canopy growth. I'll just not do as long of generative steering. I'll just push it more vegetative, right? And so we always have intensity and duration when we're talking about that. Earlier, I was talking about LCG, where my intensity will just be less either way or the other for almost the whole duration. For something like Mac 1, I like to give it a little blip of hard generative just to get those flowers set. And, that might be 5 days, 10 days max. On the other side of the spectrum, if we know this plant's morphological representation is more of a sativa type, then classic sativa. Everything now is so crossed and blended. I don't know that those are appropriate, but if we go back 10 years and you think of a sativa plant and that morphology, then yeah, let's run generative longer, right? So look at plant height. If you can document that through obviously the first day of flower to probably week 4, see if you can get 2 to 3 readings at the minimum a week. That'll at least give you kind of a curve to work off of. Hey, when does this plant start to in stretch? When does it in stretch? And that's when I try to match up my vegetative type growth. So if you didn't do that on the last run where it didn't perform, maybe you have that data to work off of for the next run, right? If we kept running generative even past stretch, then let's tighten that up a little bit. If we ended generative too early and we saw, all right, well, shoot, the first day I did vegetative, I saw 1.25 inch plant growth every day, then let's keep running generative a little bit longer, right? So try to categorize it in a little bit what I would consider traditional, morphological categories, and see how it goes. Best thing you can do is document and then compare some of those results to the documentation you have.
Yeah, crop registration, absolutely key, man. Be able to go in and just document those changes over time so that you understand, what am I doing? What did it result in? And if you are going to try to make changes, ideally having, data flows to look back on to be able to make iterative change decisions from is going to be the strongest position to be in, so that you're able to understand from a threshold by threshold perspective on your space what resulted in what you're seeing. Jason's example of Mac is a great one. The first time I ever grew a Mac 1 strain, I ended up treating it very similarly to a sherbhead plant that was growing next door. And that was a terrible mistake. The sherbhead plant loves to be run super generatively, and the Mac did not appreciate that one bit and ended up very stressed out by the end of week 3 because I had been pushing it just way too hard through that early generative stage. And in future rounds, when I was looking back and trying to grow Mac again and looking back at that data, it was really clear. I'm like, oh, I pushed the same way I did on this other strain that loves that generative steering strategy. And it really seemed like the bud production, it got started quickly, but then everything didn't really have the strength to grow big during its vegetative bulk stage. And it seemed like that was common across every Mac plant in that room at the time. And the next time I grew it, I kind of what Jason said, I backed off on the gas pedal a little bit there. And um, I did much better that round with it. And then in preceding rounds, started going a little bit more similar, even to what Jason said, and actually barely doing much generative steering with that strain at all, and allowing it to move pretty directly into its vegetative steering after bud set had started to occur. Because if I pushed it much harder, I was getting proportionately more loose, airy buds every time I did that.
We are all about the crop registration around here. All right. Well, thank you, IndieBuzz, for your question. And I actually have another one related to crop registration here from our Grow Me Iron Armor. They wrote, growing Girl Scout cookies and getting smaller top nugs and bigger bottom nugs. What are the main crop registration points to focus on to help get a better understanding of why this is happening? Mikey mentioned this a little bit last episode, maybe feel a little better that I'm not the only one getting smaller top nugs than my bottom nugs when growing Girl Scout cookies. What do you guys think?
I just got a shout out here to Iron Armor. You guys don't hear me talk about members of the show very often here, but he's been watching for pretty consistently here since almost the beginning. One time I was at a client facility and was chatting with the guy, and he's like, "I'm Iron Armor." And I was like, "Yeah!" So super glad to see you in here asking questions.
You actually met Iron Armor? That's so cool. But yeah, for real.
Yeah,
Iron Armor's been with us from the beginning.
Super fun. With Girl Scout cookies, smaller nugs on top than on bottom. And I guess some of this kind of comes down to density as well. Are they smaller on top because we're seeing better density? The lower ones are larvier. Are you seeing your best buds through the middle section of the canopy? Kind of a generic, boring answer, but canopy uniformity is really the only thing that I can go for here. Sure, there might be some genetic susceptibility more on a Girl Scout cookies for this, where it's not transporting some of those nutrients and chemical reactions across the plant quite as evenly as some others. But the best thing that you could do there is canopy uniformity, right? So when we think about, all right, do we have good airflow through there? Do we have good lighting? Whether that be we need to de-leaf more, change our plant spacing, or introduce something like under canopy lighting. Maybe we need to turn down our lights above and do under canopy lighting. Really, if we want the best performance out of all of the plant, then we have to have ideal parameters and have it uniform across the canopy itself, right? In both horizontal span and vertical span.
I was going to say I've experienced the lower or the smaller bud on top. Well, now Jason loves to say this, strain dependently. That's been one of the ones that I've actually seen. Some plants on tray A, some plants on tray B. The plants on tray B end up with smaller nugs on the top of it and are pretty similar height, pretty similar feeding schedule and irrigation strategy. But at the end of the day, the one of the strains really seemed to morphologically make a lot more canopy density around the bud sites around the top, which is more or less what I expect. And then as a result, there was not enough space for a lot of those buds to grow all that much larger. They weren't just bulking out and becoming these huge colas like the strain next door was. And maybe some of that's to do with my feeding strategy at the time with those. There could have been some other environmental factors, but by and large, all the other major things that I was documenting at the time were pretty similar. But most of what I was paying attention to at that period of time was, like my leaf surface temps around that height in the canopy, trying to document the density of the canopy, kind of what Jason got to with the uniformity of your canopy and like both light and airflow, being able to get a good mix of temperature homogenization across that canopy. All those things are important to be able to take into consideration when you're looking at factors that are playing into those morphological changes.
Awesome. Thank you guys. And Iron Armor, thank you for your question and for being one of the Grommies. We appreciate you. All right. Moving on. We got more coming in on YouTube. Okay, we got this one from Justin. They wrote, I always understood that higher VPD, greater than 1.4, stresses the plant and causes them to close their stomata. However, I've seen grows that have VPDs much higher with people running in temperature in the lower 80s with humidity in the lower 50s and 40s. And it seems like their plants are doing fine. So please, can I grow just fine with a high VPDs?
It's weed. You can grow just fine in almost all parameters, but the details come into what is fine, right? It is fine. Keep us in the position in the market where we're a competitive, high quality grower. I don't know the answer for you there. It depends on how good your branding is and how picky your customers are. But sure, there's really no argument. The science is there, and actually, Dr. Justice over with the hip mine and CRC, they did a pretty cool study with Lycor. Look it up. I was just sharing it. It's been out there for a couple of years, and basically they just plotted stomatal conductance with some other variables, right? And so when we look at what stomatal conductance is, obviously it's here. We'll show you. We'll get drawing here because we haven't drawn anything all day long. Let's go. And then we'll start on this side. And I really should be using the computer and sharing with you guys, but we'll see what I can do to draw stomates.
We love a drawing. We love that whiteboard.
Forgive me. Yeah. So obviously, on this side, we've got a really well closed up stomate. I should put 3 of these. This would be like ideal VPD, right? And so we're getting as much carbon exchange with the plant as we possibly can. Obviously, when our stomates close up a little bit, then we're not getting as much carbon exchange. And obviously carbon is the building block of most plants. So we want as much carbon exchange in there. When we talked about the equation there, CO2 plus water, our equation's going to be based on how much CO2 we can get in there. So the more CO2 we get in there, the better chance our plants are to growing to the amount of water and to the amount of light that's given to them, right? For photosynthesis, like that's where our building blocks come from. Yes, there are secondary photosynthetic activities that are happening based on available nutrients, based on lighting spectrum, all that types of stuff. But in order for the first chemical reaction to go on, we got to have these stomates as open as possible. So here's our basic chart of VPD. Obviously, when our VPD is low here, for example, then our stomates are going to be more like the closed side. They're not exchanging as much gas. When we get to VPDs, say between 1 and 4, if we want a wide range, specifically for cannabis, this is different for other types of plants, then our stomates are going to be maximized here. And that's where we want the most gas exchange as possible. So when we're thinking about building the highest amount of plant mass, we have to be optimizing the stomatal conductance. Our gas exchange needs to be maximized. Now, when we get VPDs that are a little bit high, and for maybe for some strains, none that I've worked with really, 1.6, 1.5, maybe that's where they're at. Like I said, these biological factors aren't as well defined as just us telling you what the answer is here on the TV, computer, phone, Spotify, however you're receiving this information today. But yeah, if it is the fact that, all right, well, maybe we're getting up here, basically that probably means that some other parameter in your grow could be optimized to get better results. So can I tell you that, hey, that's the wrong thing to do? No. Can I tell you that you may be able to achieve a little bit higher revenue for your company if you do hit those ideal VPDs? Yes. Can I tell you exactly what that VPD is? If you take a stomatal conductance meter into your grow and start taking measurements, I can help you tell you what that answer is. Otherwise, I'm here recommending, being at about 1.2 towards the end of the flower.
I think that's a really good way to put it.
Yeah, 1.4
Just
if you're worried about mold
it.
mildews.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay. Justin also dropped this additional question, which I think, considering what we're talking about, would be a good one to tackle. He's wondering, does running high humidity during mid-late flower, along with higher temps, cause airy buds if mold wasn't an issue?
Not necessarily. That'll be the shortest answer of the history of Arroyo.
No.
In the history of 127 episodes. Amazing. Okay.
No, but it definitely can be a fine line to walk with those molds and mildews. So be careful there.
Mm-hmm. Always be careful. Okay. All right, Justin, we appreciate your questions. Thank you for that. All right. We got this one from Crony. They wrote that they're growing in cocoa, feeding daily at 6.0 pH, around 1K ppm in flower. Runoff pH drops to 5.1 to 5.2 despite 20% runoff. Last run, I overcorrected with too much flushing. What's a better way to manage runoff pH?
Hey, it's kind of a theme here for today. Get started with it. We'll just wrap back around to what we were talking about. Obviously, pH being, and I can bring up the slideshow if you guys want here. Maybe we'll put a link.
Give the people what they want, Jason.
I'm surprised I haven't worn this PowerPoint out yet here, but yeah, we're looking at nutrient composition, right? So anions and balance of cations. The traditional approach of flushing, it might be half right. Is it the best solution? Absolutely not. Really what's happening is if we were flushing in that case, we're pushing a lower no EC feed in there. Really the only thing it's doing is pushing the imbalanced nutrients out, right? In a much better situation, we just replace them with a well-balanced nutrients solution. And so that's where kind of one of our answers this beginning of the episode was, all right, you might need to raise your EC, right? So the fact that nutrient burning doesn't happen until we're at unusually high ECs, means that, all right, if we want a better balance of nutrition in there, let's just put a little bit more nutrition in there. And so let's get pH up and get it shared. Give me something to work off of here. All right, share my screen, substrate pH. And we'll actually talk about ways that you can identify what is causing that, that pH change specifically. And when I say what, I mean which element is being excessed, or usually it's deficient, like I mentioned. So here's our anions and our cations, right? So when we feed at, say, 6.0, right, we've added certain types of acids or bases to, basically manipulate it. A lot of times, actually, when we use our fertilizer, we don't even have to use a acid or base. Really kind of depends on the water chemistry coming in from your water supply, what nutrients you're using, and any other supplemental stuff that's going into your fertigation. But when we look at when I say balance, I should have probably just drawn like a line or a scale between these where it's saying, all right, if we went in at 6.0, then the levels of the cations on the right and the anions on the left are causing us to be at 6.0. If they were perfectly balanced, then these are common ones. There's probably other stuff in that fertigation water as well. But if everything's balanced, then we'd be at 7.0, right? So we're going a little bit more acidic side because we're trying to optimize the nutrient availability uptake to these plants. And that's different for different types of substrates. When we're working in, cocoa, usually our optimal compromise is about 6.0 for, all right, well, these are all available across the board as max that they could without jeopardizing the availability of another one. And so when our pH is going to be shifting one way or another, it says, hey, this plant is probably eating up one of these nutrients, one of these elemental nutrients more than the other. All right. And it's kind of nice. This chart that I'm showing you here is based on, we got some of our macros up on top, and then we're migrating into some of our micros. Right. So obviously NPK, nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, or phosphorus, potassium, right here on the top, right? So if we are, early flower, a lot of times we see actually, these nitrogens causing those pHs to be out of balance. Sometimes when we're early flower, the plants are going through a lot of infrastructure growth. They're using a ton of nitrogen. And then, later in flower, we might actually see some of these, potassium and phosphorus just becoming imbalanced. And so if you send your plants in for leaf tissue analysis, let's say you're getting, a severe imbalance that is causing jeopardy to your plants, or you are that type of grower that's really kind of got everything dialed in and you want to take the next step for a specific strain, you can do some leaf tissue analysis, and that'll give you results on what your concentrations of these elements are in the plant matter itself. Obviously, that'll show you which ones are elevated, which ones are in demand, and then you can start playing either with creating your own nutrient recipes or just raising your EC. Like when we talk about just raising your EC, that's just hitting the problem with a hammer, right? We don't know exactly what the right solution, what exact elemental nutrient is in deficiency, but if we just give it more of everything, then hopefully that's going to fix that imbalance. We know it'll do a better job fixing the imbalance than giving it less of everything but pushing out the imbalance like a flush would do.
It's a great way to say that. It's not going to be an exact science trying to get yourself back on track when you add more, but you do know that you're not going to be restricting the nutrient uptake by washing everything back out of it and then trying to build back up from zero. And like Jason said, you're not going to burn the root systems by adding that initial feed EC a little bit and trying to give the plant more of what it's already seeming to go through. So, raise your feed EC.
All right. Thank you guys for that. Crony, good luck. Thank you for your question. All right. I want to try to get as many of these live questions in as we can. We got this one from Dr. Ropotnik. They wrote, they're growing in 1 gallon cocoa bricks, but thinking of switching to 3 gallon and worried about how to maintain a steady dry back with the increase in size. What tips would you guys recommend?
That's a very valid concern. If you are an indoor production grower, probably wouldn't go to a 3 gallon. Unless for some reason, if you have a very well constrained plant count and you want to grow 8-foot plants, then all right, let's go to a 3 gallon. If that's not your case, then I might stick with 1.5 to 2 gallon for the size of plants that I mostly prefer to grow, and that's 4.5 to 6 foot type of plant. 1.5 gallon is a really sweet spot of substrate size. And as far as maintaining those drybacks, yeah, it's going to be a challenge. And as we mentioned so much on this show, if you're shooting for a fairly steerable substrate, then we have to compromise that on something that'll hold more than how much our dryback is. but not too much that we can't make some EC manipulations based on how much runoff that we're pushing, right? We want our ECs to go up if we're not getting any runoff. If we're if we're trying to basically stay generative, then we can stay generative. If our substrate's too small, we have to add some vegetative shots, or we have to push more runoff than we want to. A lot of times, both those things. But if we're in a 3 gallon, then for most grows, that's a little bit larger than I like to be. Like I said, unless you've got a plant count that's restricting you, or you're outdoor. But for indoor closed grows without plant count constraints, usually that's a little bit larger than we want to be in.
Yeah, I'd say the same thing. You're going to have a harder time being able to have the consistency that you're looking for with regard to your dry back windows on a daily basis. And the other thing is you may end up uh, needing to run those plants longer to make the most of having everything in a 3 gallon pot. Kind of like what Jason was saying, when you do that, oftentimes you're restricting plant counts, or that's maybe the reason that you're running such a large substrate in the first place, and trying to get a bigger canopy out of it. If that's what you're doing, there are costs and benefits to doing that. One of the major costs is just more time. You're going to have to invest more time into vegging those plants to be able to get them to the stage of development that you really want them to be. Which, in this industry, the further past 65-day flowering window you really get, the less competitive it is for you to really be growing that strain at scale.
All right, on you guys. Thank you for that. And to Dr. Ropotnik, good luck. Thank you for your question. All right, you guys, we only have a few minutes left. We got this question on Instagram. What percentage on a moisture meter should I be looking to achieve when drying the product before it goes into boxes for cure? And I know I just read a story earlier this week on Marijuana Moment about the National Institute of Standards and Technology updating industry standards for the level of moisture. But maybe this is a good chance for us to give folks a little bit of overview of what they should be taking into consideration at the drying and the curing stage.
Yeah, so let's just kind of start off with the definition of drying versus curing. During drying, I'm actually trying to drop those moisture contents in the plant. Right, when we start with, we're going to be typically 85+% water moisture content in a growing cannabis plant, like living cannabis plants. So when we cut it, that's basically what it's going to be at. And we're going to try and achieve the probably 12-15% moisture content there by the end of drying. There's going to be some caveats that I'm going to talk about here in just a minute, but when we go into curing, for me, ideally, curing is not changing how much moisture content is actually in my product. Right. So in my cure room, I want it to be the humidity that my target water activity is. And the question asker here, the submitter is going to be like, well, I didn't talk about water activity or humidity. I talked about moisture content. Well, these things are all important when we're trying to hit those, moisture contents. And moisture content is probably not the best number to use. Water activity for me is a little bit more accurate, a little bit easier to use because I am perfectly related to the humidity of in my environment. So if I have a product that comes out at 0.6 or let's say 0.55 water activity, if I leave it in a room that's 55% humidity, I could come back a long time later. It's still going to be 55%, or it's going to be 0.55 water activity. That 0.55 water activity is also matching the humidity in the room, right? So when we're at 0.55 and 55% in the room, we're at equilibrium. There's no water transfer to the environment, to the room. There's no water transfer into the plant or into the dry bud, now that we've defined those two stages. So if you are in that situation, then you just need to think about, what does my end product need to be most sellable, right? Am I somebody that's supplying quarters and halves, ounce bags to people that are rolling a lot of joints? I might want my product a little bit drier side, simply because, well, I can get higher THC numbers if it's drier, but also because that's a little bit easier to process for the end user. Maybe I'm rolling joints internally, a little bit easier to process. if I'm going into premium jars. I might want to be a little bit higher in those moisture contents. Basically, where I start with is thinking about, well, what do we got? We got a minute. Let's talk about isotherms. Basically, when we think about moisture content, we also have to identify and water activity. I know this is all about moisture content, but for me, my brain always thinks about water activity. Isotherms look like something like this. So let's go water content, water activity. Right. So we can basically chart those two together. And at some point for a specific type of product, we can always predict either water activity or moisture content, water content, moisture content, whatever, based on the isotherm. So that's a relationship between these two for a specific product. There are some published things for generalized cannabis. And, as far as how do we achieve that? Well, yeah, dry your product to the moisture content that you want. And then obviously, if you can process it and store it in an environment that is the same water activity as that moisture content that you wanted, then you can guarantee that that's what's going out the door, right? So a lot of times it's got to be 4 or 5 dozen clients that I've worked with, and they have just come back with very positive things about having climate control in their processing rooms. The fact that it takes the strain off them to make sure the product gets processed quickly or put back out of the processing room. Yeah, just climate control your process room so that you're at the humidity you want your water activity in those plants to be, right? And the longer we leave it in there, the closer it actually gets to where we want it to be. Cian, go.
I was going to say that's a great suggestion. Just make sure that you're, watching that when you are thinking about your processing. If you don't have a climate controlled processing room, you may be over drying in there in a way that you aren't really catching if you're not tracking your water activity. Like Jason said, playing to your market's a big part of this because some people may not want to buy your product at certain water activity levels. However, the trend right now, it seems like, is that 0.55 mark that that Jason was talking about earlier. That seems to be kind of the sweet spot for most producers these days because it's well under the level you're going to have any microbial issues developing, any botrytis or any sort of molds, mildews on the flower, and you're also keeping your water activity high enough and at a stable point where you're not going to have much moisture exchange with that cannabis as it sits, like Jason said, in stable shelf life. You're going to have a much wider selling window if you're able to control that moisture activity rather than just looking at it through the lens of moisture content. So the other thing to think about that I think a lot of people kind of overlook is that when you tend to measure things kind of by the a mixture of moisture content and the old like snap the branch method, I was really surprised to find that I tend to estimate on the drier side of things, which you leave a lot of money on the table by doing that. And it's worth understanding that at scale, if you are able to come to market and package a product that is, at 0.55, you're going to have essentially a higher yield than you would have packaging at 0.4.
Bam. All right. With that, we're done, y'all, for the day. Thank you so much, Jason and Cian, for holding it down and covering all these wonderful questions. Thank you, producer Chris, as well, for another great session. And thanks to all of you for joining us for this week's Arroyo Office Hours. To learn more about Arroyo, book a demo at arroyo.io, and our team will show you the ins and outs of the ultimate cannabis cultivation platform. If you have any crop steering or cultivation questions you want us to cover, we didn't get to your question today, drop them anytime in the Arroyo app. Email us at sales@arroyo.io or send us a DM. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and we want to hear from you. If you're a fan of the pod, please leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, or wherever you listen to your podcast. We appreciate your feedback, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube so you never miss an episode. Thanks, y'all. See you on episode 128.